welcome back to the podcast, friends, for another episode. And today we're talking about social justice and, in particular, the area of environmental justice, because they're really pretty much intertwined. If you're going to have one, you got to have the other. And so today, Rick Smith, who is the head of the Green Team here at St. Peter and Paul Jesuit Church, talks to us. We talk about the Peace Corps. We talk about um, uh, critical race theory, think tanks, and it's kind of like the big picture of community social work. And this episode is actually going to be in two parts. So this episode in particular, we talk about some of the big picture things regarding community social work. And in part two, we're going to talk more about the Green Team, which is our creation care team here, and then some ways that Rick has personally implemented environmental justice into his life and into the community where he lives. So I think you're going to really enjoy it. Um, we don't go real deep on some of these topics, so it's kind of more of an intro level, although I really want to have him back to dig into critical race theory and think tanks a little bit more. But in the meantime, here is episode 1. Enjoy.
My name's Rick Smith, and this is my second Jesuit institution. We're here at St. Peter Paul Jesuit. I also attended St. Mary's Student Parish in Ann Arbor when I was a student at the University of Michigan. University of Michigan is where John F. Kennedy announced the Peace Corps.
Okay.
And then there's a plaque on State Street in front of the Michigan Union that has his face on it, memorializes the fact that the Peace Corps was launched at like 1 a.m. at a rally on the steps of the Michigan Union. And my mom was a big fan of John F. Kennedy, as many Irish Catholic mothers were. So she was very fond of the Peace Corps, and I wanted to get into the Peace Corps. This was back in the days when you filled out paper applications for the Peace Corps, and they had boxes. They had boxes where you could check your 3 preferred countries. These were long applications you had to do. For the boxes that I just said I would go anywhere.
That's what you said?
Yeah, and I knew Spanish, so I figured they would send me someone Spanish speaking. I didn't know at the time that if you speak Spanish, they probably won't send you to. Like, this is the weird thing because many Spanish speaking countries, which I didn't realize at the time, you might be in a village where the people in the village don't actually speak Spanish. They might speak Quiche or Quechua, depending on it would be one of the indigenous languages. But yeah, I said I'd go anywhere, and I was assigned to Mongolia, and that would be Outer Mongolia. And let's see, at the time, Peace Corps Mongolia, they had volunteers who taught English. They had volunteers working in the national parks. They had some volunteers doing business development. And then they had some volunteers working in healthcare institutions, which for the most part were schools. And I was teaching English. So Mongolia, I very transformative. Um, when I got off the plane, the airport's out in the countryside, and the country is very rural and sparsely populated, and the capital area is in the mountains. It's about a mile high, like Denver, but you can smell the fresh wildflowers. So, because it was July, you could smell the wild thyme, the wild onions, and it was just in time for their Independence Day festival called Naadam, the festival of 3 manly sports. The 3 manly sports are horseback riding, wrestling, and archery. So women actually do horseback riding and archery, and for horseback riding, they start kids at age 2. But wrestling, women are not allowed to wrestle because the men wrestled with their shirts off. They wear this decorative, vest, and the reason they do that, the tradition is that women used to do the wrestling as well, but then they would always beat the guys, so they banned the women wrestling. And so the wearing not wearing the shirt was a way to make sure that a woman wasn't sneaking in the rest.
Oh, got it.
Like I just took that as a given. I didn't question the rest. And I've heard the story several times. But like kind of like a very other world, the women, work very hard. It's an animal husbandry country. Now I was teaching English in a medium-sized city of maybe 25,000. I was at a teacher's college, but the building was a former elementary school, and half of it was still being used as an elementary school. I was in one of the warmer parts of the country in the winter, which meant it only got to 20 below freezing instead of 40 below freezing. But 20 below freezing is cold enough that the ink pens you use actually freeze. We had heat, but we also had maybe some windows that didn't quite shut or occasionally broken, so the draft would freeze the ink pens, and then the students would have to kind of breathe heavy on them to get them to write again. And my students were mostly women. It was a teacher's college, but I had some young men, and this was a regional college, so it served maybe 4 provinces in the eastern part of Mongolia, learning to become elementary school teachers for the most part. And they had a K-10 system, and it was residential, so they had dormitories. And we had to Peace Corps volunteers, they have a primary assignment, and then they're supposed to do community development to come up with a secondary project they need to do in the summer.
Grand Prix starting early.
Yeah, the Grand Prix never ends. Maybe not Germaine. I had an idea, there was a movement, the Grand Prix off Belle Isle. And then I thought maybe Rouge Park would host the Grand Prix. It's about the same size. And then, of course, the neighbors there probably wouldn't appreciate the traffic disruption. And that probably wouldn't further environmental justice. But we have to do what we can. So I wasn't sure what to do with my secondary project. I'd been tutoring. I tutored the city I was in was powered by a coal-fired plant that was getting some renovation. Was tutoring their chief operations officer in Microsoft Excel. And not that I'd ever had a class in that. It was like a 1 day session, and I was compensated with uh, mutton dumplings, which is the local delicacy. And I'd kind of been tutoring English to their provincial economic development director. He was kind of like a one-person show. But the school they wanted me to paint one of the classrooms, and that's a project. And
Now, was it just like regular painting or was it like a mural?
we were supposed to do murals, right?
Okay.
That's the classic Peace Corps experience is you do a map, a
Got it.
mural of a map in the classroom. I should have done that there, but I did. We had a mechanism where volunteers could write grants and get money to fund their project. And I did get the money, and then I got sick and had to leave early, so they never got the money. But I did get experience with grant writing. 'Cause they'd actually already purchased all the paint, and it was actually already painted, and they'd already bought the TV for the auditorium. Oh well. Uh, so I ended up coming back to teach at the University of Colorado. Well, the University of Colorado hired the Spring Institute for Intercultural Relations, which also based in Denver, and they teach English to refugees. And so I was in Mongolia. They also would teach for Denver-based businesses, of which the university is one. The university was trying to open a branch campus at the University of Ulaanbaatar. So at the capital, it does get 40 below at night, and it gets so cold that the satellite dishes freeze and the internet goes out. Yeah, you freeze too, but I generally wore 3 layers of long johns, pants, a suit, would have my wool hat, gloves.
I forget that Mongolia is north of us.
That's the thing,
Yeah.
right? It's and Mongolians here, they don't find Michigan to look all that different. They might, depending on where they are in the country. Mongolians can be hillier. Where I was in the Peace Corps was grassland, so that would be like the Dakotas. But the capital may be more like a Colorado. But yeah, weather-wise, snow. One thing that Mongolians here, a little bit of culture shock is squirrels. Um, here we have urban squirrels, and in Mongolia you don't get urban squirrels. You might get urban reindeer or urban, like I had camels. Camels would come and get parked outside my window when I lived in eastern Mongolia. And then in the capital, I would get reindeer. That you'd have to go at least up to Roscommon or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's not quite the same, as far as the wilderness. We get the wild turkeys here in Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
So I taught English there for a year, and that, I got to know a lot of the expatriates, people at the United Nations, and they asked me to work at UNICEF for a while. They needed someone to edit grant reports. Basically, what had happened is teaching English, I enjoyed it, and I would meet other English teachers. And there's a very, the career path for someone who does English teaching as a second language. You work your way up. You go from, say, Korea and Japan, and you try to work your way up to a gig in Jordan or Saudi Arabia, where you actually get paid more than you would in the United States. And they would pay for your apartment, maybe a chauffeured car, and then you would just pocket all your money because, most of your expenses were paid for. And then, your social outlet would be the British Embassy, which is one of the few places that was allowed to sell alcohol. Or it didn't appeal to me. I wanted something more mission oriented. Not that it is important to know English, but it tends to be couched in we're teaching you to get a job. So I wanted something more than that. And UNICEF had that. UNICEF is the United Nations Children's Fund. They had programs at the time. They are the largest distributor of vaccines. Until recently, it was mostly the United States Agency for International Development that paid for those vaccines. I don't know what's going on now, but they had that's their main program is the vaccine delivery, making sure that it stays cooled all the way from warehouse in Denmark to a village in Mongolia. They also had an education program to make sure everyone would have access to education, child protection. They also do some community development projects. The one I got most familiar with, they called it, I think, the Local Program of Action. That was one. And then they had the Bamako Initiative, which was a revolving, they would set up pharmacies as cooperatives with a revolving loan fund. So I got to see some of those sites. And Local Program of Action was participatory community development. So they would train people in whatever nation to do this method, and then they would have kind of like weekend workshops with community residents and leaders, develop priorities, do a project plan, identify locally available resources. So the site I went to, there had been a rather severe blizzard, so they wanted to do something to be able to respond for future blizzards. And they came up with a cooperative water wells and a cooperative animal feed store where the community could come together and store extra hay for animals in the winter in case there was another blizzard. So that that environment, I was moving towards social work. One of my mentors as an undergraduate was a social worker. He ran Project Community at the time. His name's Joseph Glura. He just retired 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
From University of Michigan. He'd also run the undergraduate social work program, which was called Community and Social Action. I don't think he was in the Peace Corps, but he inspired a lot of people to go to the Peace Corps, including his son. The Peace Corps experience really led me to social work, and I'm a community social worker in the sense that I was trained to do kind of community development, as I described, where you work with communities and community leaders to work with locally available resources and address locally felt needs. Most social workers you would meet are clinical social workers who tend to work in a healthcare clinic, maybe a substance abuse clinic, maybe older adult services, doing case management for group workers. And I actually teach community social work and social policy as well, and a lot of data analysis. My graduates end up working for places like Allied Media Company, Allied Media Projects. They used to do a national conference every year on how to get the message out on your advocacy campaign or what have you. And one of my students within 2 years became executive director, co-director, and ran the co-ran the organization for about 5 years. One of my students is a county commissioner at night, and by day, development director for one of the local nonprofits, a fundraiser. One of my students was director of climate advocacy at Eastside Community Network, for example. We have organizations in town that really double down on environmental justice. And on that, one thing that's reason for social work in the past, I think it's 15, no, 10-ish, 15 years, there is an international federation of social work. And in concert with the United Nations Rio Plus 20, so that would be the World Summit on Sustainable Development. Sustainable development is the marriage of environmental development, social development, economic development. The Vatican was there, and I went to their presentation where they didn't launch Laudato Si, but they used that as a framework at this convention to describe how the world church was promoting the solidarity economy and the vision that is found in Laudato Si, the encyclical on care for creation. And indeed, the name of the document that came out of the United Nations Summit was The World We Want. And that was very much, the two documents were very much developed in a parallel process. So, likewise, the International Social Work Organization really embraced environmental justice or ecological justice, the difference between the two being ecological justice sees the relationship of humans, other species as integral. And that's the way I think the church sees it.
Right.
Historically, the environmental justice movement tends to focus on marginalized human populations, particularly people of color, in Detroit, predominantly African Americans, but also Latinos, indigenous people in Southwest Detroit. So when I came back from that conference, at a social work conference in the state, I met other social workers interested in environmental and ecological justice, and we wrote our accreditation body saying that they should add environmental justice as a competency, and they did. We were actually surprised it was that easy. We just tacked one word onto the existing competencies, and they're still there. They got so that one, it's advanced human rights and social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. I chair the St. Peter and Paul Green Team, and that competency very much aligned with the Green Team mission. Now, social work also as social work in the U.S. One of our accreditation competencies is engage anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion (ADEI) in practice. That also is very much aligned with St. Peter and Paul Parish's Welcoming and Inclusion Commission. Social justice is a core value of social work, and it has been for over 100 years. The first school of social work in the U.S. was the New York School of Social Work, which was a standalone training institute that in 1898 got folded into Columbia University as a master's degree program, a bachelor's degree program, and doctorates came later, much later. First master's, then doctorate, then bachelor's, and other certificate, or there's associate's degrees too. So you can become a social work tech.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, yes, I, I think I have met one person who is a social work tech. But at many community colleges, you can get an associate's degree in social work, and that qualifies you under Michigan law to get a social work tech license. But the scope of practice is the most constrained.
Right.
You'd probably be working in like a residential facility or hospital doing very entry level tasks.
Yeah. Probably like my undergrad is family life education, which I think they've changed now to family life studies. Probably similar to this social work tech is what I'm going to
Yeah.
guess.
Now you just finished your master's of nonprofit.
Yeah, global nonprofit leadership.
From Wayne State.
No, MSU. It was actually a brand new program. The long title is Nonprofit Leadership, Global Cultures, and Social Enterprise. So,
Oh, good.
yeah, so we were happy when they shortened it
Yeah, we should talk a little bit about social enterprise. Now, was that from the business school, James Madison College?
Actually, they ran it out of their religious department, which is really interesting. We had a lot of courses that were looking at how nonprofit is done in other countries and decentering Western mindset, Western assumptions of nonprofit and policies and stuff like that, and a huge chunk on secularization means in other settings. Like it means one thing in the US, it means something different and functions totally different in other countries.
Yeah, that's critical. Mongolia had nonprofits, and in most other countries, they're referred to as non-governmental organizations.
Right.
So in
Yeah.
Mongolian, that's Turin Bish Bibaluk. Yeah, Turin Bish Bibaluk. So Tur is government, Bish is non, and then whatever organization is, which I'm kind of stuck on. They were the not government. Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
literal translation.
NGOs instead of
NGOs.
NPOs. Yeah.
Yeah, and there were there another nuance, nonprofits that are explicitly created by a government and the ones created by private citizens. That distinction, I think, is important and not always clearly understood. Now, I did for 5 or 6 years, I taught the international social work at Wayne State, and we went over some of that. We taught that online. Our online courses at the School of Social Work are asynchronous. So, and then I get to play multimedia website designer to get them through the course. One thing I did with that, the course hadn't been offered in a few years, and because of my experience at the United Nations Summit on Sustainable Development, I was able to update the material, which previously focused on the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. If you are local in Detroit, sometimes when you go by Huntington Place, you'll see the sign for the Sustainable Development Goals. And I have an app on my phone that kind of rolls through them. One of the things I used to tell the students is I asked them what were the primary goal of the Millennium Development Goals, which were launched in 1990 when I was still in college. And the United Nations set a goal that by the year 2015, global poverty would be cut in half. And I asked them, did we make that goal or not? And all the students would say no. And I said, well, actually, we did, and we surpassed it. And they were shocked. So, well, I don't know about. We'll unpack that throughout the whole.
Right.
Why is it that we don't know that government can be successful at
Right.
achieving goals that are massive? The last year I taught it during the pandemic, that was the first year we started to see backsliding on these. Some of the, some goals we hadn't achieved, today, now we're seeing increasing political polarization, increasing poverty, decreasing life expectancy. But it's fairly recent. Like we had been on multi-decade trajectory of improved quality of life global, tremendous global achievement. I was talking a little bit about accreditation, and I think one thing you wanted to ask is, given the current change in administration at the federal level,
Right.
how did that impact social work education? Now,
Yeah.
the short answer is it hasn't because we still have the same accreditation standards. So we
Right.
went forward to make sure all our syllabi were updated with the new language around the main change from the last time the accreditation standards get updated once every 7 years. And the main change this time, two of the competencies, the order was flipped, and then phrase anti-racism
Hmm.
and inclusion was added. So the old competency was diversity and difference, and the new one says anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So they actually expanded it.
Expanded it, and yes, it went in 2022, and there was a campaign by many to use this language, and there was an ongoing discussion about there was a discussion, a movement to formally adopt critical race theory as a framework. And it looks like that is maybe not explicit, but some of the language from critical race theory is there. So, what is critical race theory? In 1984, a law professor named Catherine Crenshaw wrote a classic article on intersectionality in law. And the word intersection, the metaphor she's using is a street intersection, which is very appropriate because the Grand Prix is about to happen.
Right.
And she had been working on cases. The case she described as sort of the opener is she had a black woman who was fired from a job, and the black woman claimed she was discriminated against. But the boss said, "Well, I haven't fired any of my black men, and I haven't fired any other women." And the lawyer was saying, "Well, that's kind of the point. Like, there's something about being a black woman that is different from being a black man or a white woman." And the metaphor Crenshaw used was it's like street intersections. You might have the gender street, you might have the race street, and then they intersect, and that is where you get a very particular identity. In the article, she said, "Well, I don't know if that's because, lawyers do have to figure out the cost of the damage if they're suing for money. I don't know if that should be a plus sign or a multiplication. It might depend on the circumstances, but based on my analysis, I know that it's different being, and Crenshaw is a black woman. It's different being a black woman than being a black man or a white woman. It just is." That theory is so incredibly controversial. There's a whole think tank at a liberal arts college that shall remain nameless down the road that is devoted to stopping critical race theory. Some of that got incorporated into the executive orders from the new administration and most certainly underpins Project 2025 asterisk. I couldn't, I didn't actually read Project 2025, but that liberal arts college down the road, I constantly get like social media ads about their, they like want me to read about the evils of critical race theory.
It didn't come out of Project 2025 didn't come out of that college, did it?
No,
No.
Project 2025 is the policy wish list from the Heritage
Right.
Foundation in
That's
Washington,
what I'm saying.
D.C., and that think tank is aligned with that particular college. So the think tanks in D.C., Heritage Foundation is sometimes described as a Christian think tank. Maybe they would identify as a conservative. I would call it like it is a family oriented, like a faith and family oriented think tank.
My understanding it's specifically evangelical Christian, correct? Or no?
I don't know if it would. I wouldn't call it specifically evangelical. Like I think they would be. I think they would have people who were Calvinists, for example, or there are very prominent Catholics there,
Oh, I didn't.
including the current OMB. The director of Project 2025 was at Heritage and is now director of the office, White House Office of Management above the budget, and he is publicly identifies as Roman Catholic. There is a conservative Catholic think tank in Michigan. Father Robert Sirico runs it. It's the Mercatus Institute in Grand Rapids. This is just my opinion, connecting the dot. Like if you look, I always look and see who funds think tanks.
Right.
So Heritage Foundation is funded by General Motors and, a lot of corporate. What I find is that the companies connected with mining and oil tend to fund conservative think tanks. There's two other big conservative think tanks in DC. One is the American Enterprise Institute. Some describe it as a moderate think tank. Some describe it as the neoconservative think tank. Some describe it maybe as the communitarian think tank, which is to say, neoconservatives believe in that it's important for the U.S. to have a strong military and to intervene strategically overseas. That's very different than Heritage Foundation, I think, is backed off from that. We'll get to Cato in a sec. AEI also, they espouse a communitarian social policy, which is to say social problems are very important and they should primarily be the responsible of the local. So yes, we should address homelessness, but it should be addressed locally. And there is a inspiration from the cooperative movement in broadly and the kibbutz movement in Israel. Cato is the libertarian think tank, so they believe in free trade, immigration rights, very limited, if no military. Business would thrive if we weren't trying to be the military. So they do identify as a peace, a think tank that promotes peace through economic freedom. So currently, of those three, probably Heritage Foundation is most closely aligned with policies of the current administration, and then after that, AEI. The current administration is not aligned at all with the Cato Institute. When Ronald Reagan and Nixon had more of an alignment with the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute came up with the Section 8 voucher program, the negative income tax, which became, that might have been it was Milton Friedman who came up with the idea of a negative income tax. And he might have been at another think tank. But so there is an executive order to direct the Department of Education, one, to close, but the one that before they close, if they close, to direct accreditation bodies to remove any DEI or DEAI from accreditation standards.
And that would include your critical race theory.
Yes, but I don't think critical race theory made it in here. Well, implicitly it is. But we do have a competency to teach students anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, the current administration does explicitly say that they believe in anti-racism, but they also say they don't want to see diversity, equity, and inclusion. But they also don't define it.
Really, they don't. There's no definition.
Yeah. So each agency has come up with their own guidance. Last month, the National Institutes of Health put up their one-page guidance on executive order. It said projects that further DEI are not, don't further the mission of the National Institutes of Health and will not be funded. Definition of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Definition of DEAI, diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And that's it. That's the only definition. Now, one thing buried in those orders, tucked away, was we also don't fund environmental justice. And that's where the Green Team comes in, but also Laudato Si and this UN conference on sustainable development, Rio Plus 20. One of the intentional parts of that was to align social policy and environmental policy. And so social justice and environmental justice are integral. That thread I had, if you look at who funds these think tanks, arguably it's companies that have the biggest environmental impact. So all this social stuff, that's what gets the attention. The shift in environmental policy is also happening. And that is because they are intrinsically intertwined. It's people of color, people with low incomes, people who work long hours. They're the ones who face environmental exposures. And if you ban funding any research to identify, show environmental impacts, so that kind of, it's my understanding from the press that accreditation bodies for law and psychology have already preemptively caved and removed any accreditation standards around diversity, even though they aren't legally required to do so yet. So that's we're in a bit of a holding pattern with social work education, because right now our accreditation body still requires us to teach students how to work with people who are not like them and to treat people fairly, also to comply with the law. The laws of this country haven't changed. We still have an Americans with Disabilities Act. We still have a Civil Rights Act. We still have a Fair Housing Act, and those all grant us rights. We still have an equal opportunity employment. We also have state law, and our state laws have protections as well. And professionals need to know about them in order to do their jobs. And from a Catholic social teaching perspective, one element of that is solidarity and the preferential option for the poor. Another element is subsidiarity, which is to recognize that business and issues should be handled at best at the most local level possible. In the Catholic context, parishes should have some autonomy, dioceses, etc. And by the way, I'm chair of the Green Team here. But it makes sense because it has been in alignment with my research and teaching on sustainability. The Green Team came out, Father Gary Wright. What had happened in the parish is the Pope Francis Center grew so big, it became a standalone nonprofit. They still minister here, but they also have this brand new, incredible facility a few blocks from the University of Detroit Dental School, right off 96. And Father Gary said, well, what are we going to do as a parish? And he brought a group of parishioners together, and we started a year-long discernment process. And one of the things that came out of that discernment process was we should have a green team. Really embraced the vision of Laudato Si to care for the common home.